Well, here we are. Different background. Door. Yes, obvious. Look, this door's pretty old. It's got a history. And I'm interested in looking at the concept that history is not value three. A lot of people think what's on the net, social media, encyclopedias, books, libraries is history. And it is history, but history told by a particular group or an individual in a particular way. History is like looking at a clump of trees. Some people will notice the trunks, some will notice the leaves, some will notice the flowers at the base of the tree, some will notice the rustling of the wind, the sun, and some will see the whole picture. And that's what's history. We never seem to have the whole picture. And the reason I'm talking about the concept of history not being value three is because of a number of issues. One, the issue of the frontier wars in Australia, which you're all familiar with, historical facts, which ran over 120 years, which never seemed to see the light of day, and the death of Elizabeth Windsor and the English pantomime surrounding her death highlights the fact there are many ways you can view a particular situation, and how you view that particular historical situation is to a significant degree depending on whether you are a participant, somebody watching, somebody who's been oppressed by a particular historical occasion, somebody who has lost that battle, or somebody who has won. And what we see in the world today is the history of the victors. But slowly, as means of mass communication are expanding, we are seeing the emergence of histories within histories within histories. And a history is just a story. It's a story about a particular event seen in a particular way. There are personal histories about individuals, there are community histories, town histories, city histories, regional histories, national histories. Yes, it is very windy here. Fortunately, the camera didn't fall, the tripod didn't fall over. But that's the beauty of doing things out in the open. So, there are different ways of looking at things. So let's look at the history of Australia. This is the land I was born in, this is where I live. Now obviously there's the pre-European history. And that history spanned 60,000 years or over 60,000 years. And it involved hundreds, about 250 distinct groups who had distinct languages, distinct cultures, distinct ways of living, who had their own history. Then we saw a period of 300 to 400 years where there was interaction between the outside world and Australia. We saw the Chinese come here in the 15th century. We saw the Indonesians not only come to northern Australia but set up trading camps for 3 months a year. where they formed associations with the local indigenous population, formed trading relationships, exchanged ideas, exchanged technology, and in some regards exchanged people. And this went on for a number of hundreds of years. Then we had the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, and eventually the English come across. And some of these interactions were peaceful and some of these interactions were violent. But eventually it led to colonisation and resistance. Not resistance on a mass scale, as we see in the Ukraine, but resistance based on specific groups and clans fighting to protect their way of life that they had known for tens of thousands of years. See, but that history disappeared. It was inconvenient because we created a new history. We created a history of exploration, of Europeans discovering a continent which had already been settled for over 60,000 years. A history of the brave explorer opening up the land for migration and settlement. But a history which ignored the plight of the original inhabitants, which numbered over 1.5 million people when colonisation began. And it wasn't until the last 20 years or so that that history has now become important. And we are seeing documentaries, films, historical events, accounts, monuments being erected to that history. So there are histories within histories within histories, and it's important to remember our histories and acknowledge the breadth of the history. Not just one element, which was the colonisation process, in order for us to be able to understand the present, understand the ramifications of those processes, and struggle to change the future, to ensure the mistakes which were made in the past are not repeated ad nauseum, as we see with nationalist wars around the world. The other history I'm interested in is the history of imperialism, because each and every one of us is a product of imperialist history, whether it was Dutch colonisation, Portuguese colonisation, Spanish colonisation, French colonisation, English colonisation. The fact is that that history is fundamental to the type of world we have created. Because the history of imperialism is not new. We've seen empire after empire after empire build its place on earth through the destruction of other people and the accumulation of their wealth. That's what imperialism is about. And even today, we see imperialist ambitions by some of the world's major countries. Imperialist ambitions of the Chinese, the Russians, the United States. Each and every one thinks that their system of government, their culture, is so perfect that it needs to be imposed on other people. It's not just a cultural or a spiritual war. It's a war which is based on resources, acquiring resources, acquiring other people's resources in order to maximise profits. And when you have a planet which is dominated by capitalism, a private investment for private profit mantra, you begin to see the damage that is not just done to human beings, but done to the planet, and the ensuing climate emergency, to which a significant degree is due to imperialism and the desire to accumulate wealth and accumulate power, irrespective of the human, social, environmental costs. And that's what history is about. And we, as a people, have never learnt from history. We don't learn from the past. And we don't learn from the past because the history we are told, the history we learn, is the history that is recorded by the conqueror. The history that tells us that the pharaohs of Egypt were somehow extraordinary human beings. The history which we see played out in the pantomime which is occurring in London currently with the burial of Elizabeth Windsor is a history of the present. It's a history with no past, no relevance to the past. And that's the beauty of living in the 21st century. We no longer think that we have any need to look at the past. We think we have the technological innovations that have occurred, which means that the lessons of the past are no longer relevant. And this is a huge flaw in history. Animals learn from the past. They learn that there are certain other animals they shouldn't interact with because they're dangerous. They learn there are plants and berries and fruits they can't access because they're dangerous. But we as human beings continue to make the same mistake over and over and over again. Not because we cannot learn, we're at the apex of intellect on the planet, but because we never seem to learn from the past. It's important to remember that your story, my story, our story, their story, all contributes to the type of people we are and the types of societies we develop. When you have a globe which is dominated by one economic theory, private investment for private profit, we reap the benefits of that economy, not just in terms of material goods, but in terms of our spiritual destruction, in terms of our understanding that we are just one species on the planet and that our future is intertwined with other species and the natural environment. When we destroy the forests to introduce monoculture for profit, we begin to understand the consequences of that. Today I'm filming out here in the cold and it's windy, but it's early spring. The sun should be out. In the northern hemisphere, the earth is parched with drought. In the southern hemisphere, we have floods. In the Himalayas and in Pakistan, and they also have floods because of the melting glaciers. And around the world, we are seeing the consequences of the domination of an economic system based on private investment for private profit. Green capitalism, the solution which is being put forward currently for the climate emergency, is no solution at all. It will buy us a little bit of time, but it will not solve the problem of the climate emergency. Increasing population growth, finite resources, increasing CO2 emissions, and the domination of the planet by an economic system based on the concept of private investment for private profit, which is destroying every human relationship on the planet. The relationship between individuals, the relationship within communities, the relationships with our environment, the relationships with nature, the relationship with people on the other side of the globe. So as we face the four horsemen of the apocalypse, increasing population growth, increasing CO2 emissions, finite resources, and the domination of the planet by an economic system based on private investment for private profit, we somehow think that the neoliberal philosophy, which was tried in the 17th and 18th century, deregulation, privatisation, globalisation, corporatization, it is nothing new. It is not a 21st century phenomenon, but it is a phenomenon of imperialism. It is a phenomenon of colonisation, where you take other people's resources and land and lives to promote your economic interests. There are no regulations, no laws, just the law of the strong. And that's what deregulation was about during the colonisation process. Then globalisation, the increased improvement in technology, steel, firearms, ships, allowed European countries to dominate the world. So there is nothing new as far as globalisation is concerned. Corporatisation, this is nothing new. The history of the 18th, 17th, 18th and 19th century was the history of private corporations, large companies going into different colonial empires and setting up their own empires which rivaled the power of the state. When you look at the British East India Company, when you look at the companies, the Dutch companies in Indonesia, you can see that corporatisation is nothing new. And then you've got privatisation. The state, for generations, for hundreds of years, for thousands of years, is nothing more than the instrument which is used by the rich and powerful to maintain their power. They exercise a monopoly on the use of force, and they use this force combined with religious belief to maintain their power. The Egyptian pharaohs believed that if they didn't wake up, the sun wouldn't rise. We have the divine rights of kings in the European monarchies. In South America, we had rulers who believed that if you ripped out the hearts of living people, you could avoid famine and the sun would continue to shine on the earth and create crops. So there was nothing new. Deregulation, privatisation, corporatisation, globalisation is not some new neoliberal philosophy, ideology, but it is more powerful in the 21st century because of instant communication, because of social media, because of the World Wide Web. Its claws are firmly embedded in each and every one of us. We are both the victims and supporters of the very processes which oppress us. And unless we learn our history, unless we learn where we come from, unless we make the effort to learn our stories and derive lessons from those stories, we will continue to make the same mistakes. The Russias of the world will continue to invade the Ukraines of the world. The United States will continue to be an imperial empire. We will continue to find ourselves in this situation if we do not understand our history.